Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Symbols of Freedom, Slavery and Resistance Before the Civil War by Matthew J. Clavin. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Any critic of the American present must have profoundly mixed feelings about our country's past. On the other hand, he will feel shame and distrust toward founding fathers who tolerated slavery, exterminated Indians, and blandly assumed that a good society must be based on private property. On the other hand, he is likely to find himself articulating his own demands in the revolutionary language of inalienable rights, a natural higher law, and the right to revolution. Stoughton Lynd, Intellectual Origins of American Radicalism, 1968. Introduction. Hail Columbia. Shortly after the War of 1812, members of the House of Representatives who had gathered near the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., saw something truly extraordinary. For years, slave traders had forced African Americans to walk in chains through the streets of the nation's capital, and politicians rarely took notice. But on this day, one of the captives drew lawmakers' attention by raising his hands and lifting his voice in opposition to his enslavement. Elevating his manacles as high as he could reach, a congressional eyewitness recalled, the captive commenced singing the favorite national song, Hail Columbia, Happy Land. Despite its spectacle, the impromptu performance seems to have had no effect on slave traders or political representatives in the capital city. Indeed, the enslaved soloist completed the chain-bound journey to a local slave pen or auction house, where he and his companions were ostensibly sold to the highest bidder. Still, the story did not end here, for a small but growing group of anti-slavery activists seized upon the incident to highlight the hypocrisy of slavery in a nation nominally dedicated to freedom. Decades later, the American Anti-Slavery Society issued a broadside entitled Slave Market of America. The oversized handbill, which included 9 artfully crafted illustrations, reveals the long and disturbing history of slavery in and around the nation's capital. In the placard's upper right-hand corner under the heading, The Home of the Oppressed, a black and white engraving offers a compelling representation of the event that took place in front of the Capitol. At the center of the scene, American flags fly on both sides of the building's rooftop dome, while congressmen amble on the steps below the iconic semicircular structure. At ground level in the picture's forefront, a dozen black men chained in pairs walk behind a white man with a whip at the ready. A slave toward the front of the coffle holds an unidentified flag in his one unchained hand as those behind him gesture, and most assuredly sing, in the direction of both the congressman and the Capitol. Underneath the rectangular image, the caption reads, Capitol of the United States, Hail Columbia. Though inspired by the actual event, the image is full of inaccuracies. Several captives sing the national anthem with their arms raised, when only one brave vocalist had committed the defiant act. That many of these bondsmen wear hats, shoes, jackets, and long pants, while carrying their personal belongings in small bags, suggests the engraver had never seen this or any other slave coffle in person, despite claims that the illustration was made by an artist on the spot. Another glaring error is the depiction of the Capitol, which at that time was in ruins. British forces had burned the so-called Temple of Liberty to the ground months earlier, forcing Congress to meet in a modest 3-story brick building nearby for years. What the iconic engraving most notably failed to capture was the revolutionary nature of the public protest. Though little known today, Hail Columbia was the first song the American people considered a national anthem. Written in honor of George Washington and the other patriots who fought and bled in freedom's cause, the hymn was a musical tribute to those who were willing to fight and die for their nation's liberation. It was also a repudiation of slavery that prayed, Truth and justice will prevail, and every scheme of bondage fail. The song's subversiveness makes its performance by an enslaved black man in front of powerful white politicians against the backdrop of the Capitol truly astonishing, even more so when considering the song's last line, which repeated the Revolutionary War-era mantra, "Death or Liberty." Like any public protest, the shackled singer's rendition of Hail Columbia can only be understood in the context of the time and place in which it occurred. Since winning independence from Great Britain in 1783, the American people had begun inventing a series of rituals, customs, and traditions to secure the foundation of the imagined community they were building out of the materials of disparate people, interests, and ideas. A decade-long surge of nationalism following the War of 1812 that became known as the Era of Good Feelings accelerated the process of nation-building. Within several years, citizens adopted several unofficial national anthems and standardized a national flag. They also began observing national holidays, including the anniversaries of George Washington's birth on February 22nd and the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. As powerful symbols of an American identity, anthems, flags, and holidays helped unify a divided people. So too did a commemorative landscape of monuments and memorials that recalled the brave sacrifice of the nation's founders, as well as their philosophy of freedom. From Boston's Bunker Hill to Independence Hall in Philadelphia and St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, where Patrick Henry offered his life for liberty, the signs of an emerging nation were everywhere. This was especially the case in Washington, D.C., where a national capital seemed to appear out of the Potomac River's swamplands overnight. In addition to these iconic symbols, a national language of freedom, which derived from the natural rights of philosophy of the Enlightenment, also served as a source of American identity. The Declaration of Independence assertion that all men are created equal, Patrick Henry's cry of liberty or death, and Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner waving over the land of the free and the home of the brave were widely repeated words and phrases that fostered a collective consciousness. Resonating across the country, they reinforced individuals' determination to build a new nation where the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was universal, natural, and inalienable. There was every reason to expect the establishment of such a truly exceptional society but for slavery. With state, local, and federal laws regarding African-descended people as property, the language and symbols that served as national touchstones made a mockery of freedom. They encouraged an empty American culture that accepted the abstract notion of equality rather than the concrete idea. For millions of enslaved people and their allies, these rhetorical expressions rang hollow. Nevertheless, as the performance of Hail Columbia by the shackled bondmen before the Capitol suggests, they continued to offer inspiration. An analysis of the role that the language and symbols of American freedom played in the conflict over slavery illuminates how enslaved people and their allies rejected the rhetorical nationalism of their pro-slavery counterparts. Interpreting both the language and symbols of freedom literally, they embraced a revolutionary nationalism that not only justified but generated forceful and even violent resistance to slavery. Mindful and proud that theirs was a nation born in blood, these disparate patriots, black and white, male and female, northern and southern, rich and poor, fought to fulfill the radical promises of the Republic and its founders by waging a real and revolutionary war against slavery. Interrogating the impact of national language and symbols comes with some risk. Long before the global turn of early American history, when wounds wrought by fascist governments in Europe and Asia in the mid-20th century remained open, scholars started rejecting the nation-state as a conceptual framework of analysis, choosing instead to adopt a less provincial and more cosmopolitan worldview in their research and writing. As a result, nationalism, which can briefly be defined as a strong attachment to and identification with the nation-state, its interests, and its people, received tremendous academic scrutiny. In the 21st century, a resurgence of authoritarian and repressive regimes in the United States, Russia, and across the globe has further damaged nationalism's reputation among scholars and students of history. Today, Yuval Noah Harari writes in his best-selling *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, academics see nationalism as a deadly plague that spread throughout the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, causing wars, oppression, hate, and genocide. The moment people in one country were infected with it, those in neighboring countries were also likely to catch the virus. The aversion to nationalism derives largely from its relationship with racism. The two historical phenomena, which appeared at the same time, share a great deal in common, so much so that the difference between racism and nationalism is sometimes difficult to determine. From the late 18th century, Europeans and their descendants built nation-states on the bedrock of white supremacy. The result was revoltingly contradictory. While white people enjoyed an unprecedented expansion of rights and liberties, non-white people faced enslavement, dispossession, and, to use historian K. Wright Lewis's term, extermination. Even so, African-descended people often identified with and fought for inclusion in these transatlantic polities. Olaudah Equiano's story is an oft-cited example. Enslaved as a child in West Africa, the Igbo captive spent his formative years traversing the Anglo-Atlantic world until buying his own freedom and settling permanently in London. In a popular anti-slavery tract describing his experiences, Equiano admitted a strong affinity for the English people and their culture. Though subjected to unthinkable emotional and physical trauma by years of captivity on English ships and in English colonies, the native African proudly considered himself almost an Englishman. That Equiano and other black people played a pivotal role in national freedom movements is unsurprising, for nationalist policies that targeted racial minorities often had unanticipated results. In the United States and South Africa, for example, these plans, programs, and procedures had the unintended consequence of consolidating and legitimating subordinated racial identity into a potential basis for resistance. According to historian Anthony Marks, efforts to codify racism that intended to unite white people unintentionally brought black people together. They moreover emboldened them to challenge their oppressors. For African-descended peoples seeking inclusion in nation-states that repressed and persecuted them, the fight for freedom was about much more than ending enslavement. It was also an effort to redefine the nation-state. By challenging existing racial paradigms, they endeavored to create egalitarian communities, governments, and societies that not only rejected slavery but racism as well. Alas, doing so proved almost impossible. In response, racial resistance often took the form of force and violence. The reason is easy to explain. Reflecting on a life full of opposition, Nelson Mandela remarked that freedom fighters quickly learned that oppressors determine the nature of the struggle, leaving the former no alternative but to copy the methods of the latter. If the oppressor uses violence, the oppressed have no alternative but to respond violently. History confirms these words. In the early United States, where racial violence was widespread, peaceful and passive resistance to slavery and white supremacy proved futile. Fortunately for enslaved people and their allies, the Republic's revolutionary birth offered a powerful model for forcefully challenging the status quo. Buoyed by this historical example, they subsequently fought not only to redeem their nation, but the idea of a nation as well. Despite nationalism's racist roots, it still matters. Indeed, it is a powerful and persistent global force, which historians ignore at their peril. We can write history that implicitly denies or ignores the nation-state, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Carl Degler declared decades ago. But it would be a history that flew in the face of what people who live in a nation-state require and demand. Encouraging historians to continue to write a national history of the United States, Degler urged, "This pursuit will gain for us a history that is distinctly American, not simply because it happened to us, but because it did not happen to others." Symbols of Freedom acknowledges nationalism's significance in the early United States. Therefore, it is important to briefly consider the closely related concept of patriotism. While there is no entry for nationalism in the first edition of Noah Webster's American Dictionary, the 1828 work defines national as being attached or unduly attached to one's own country. Patriotism, by contrast, is described favorably as the love of one's country. Since then, nationalism has become a negative term, meaning an aversion to, or even hatred of, foreign nations and people, while patriotism has also taken on a pejorative connotation. This study contextualizes these terms in the time when the United States and the very idea of a nation-state were in their infancy. As such, it takes its cues from new and important histories of the early American Republic, which show that nationalism and patriotism once carried more positive meanings. Highlighting nationalism's influence on slavery and anti-slavery resistance in the early United States requires a significant departure from the historical literature, which has de-emphasized national identity. While slavery alone was always enough to spark slave opposition, enslaved people drew added inspiration from various sources. Since the late 20th century, Black nationalist scholars have highlighted the significance of race consciousness and racial solidarity in stimulating slave resistance among African-descended people. Exposing the pursuit of Black people throughout the Atlantic world to establish race-based communities and societies, they downplay the attachment of these men and women to traditional Western nation-states. More recently, historians of the Atlantic world have established numerous instances of enslaved Americans forcefully opposing their bondage after learning of the measures adopted by foreign nations, namely Haiti, France, and Great Britain, on the behalf of freedom. Still, it is important to remember that the United States had its own revolutionary tradition, which similarly inspired captive people. As this study reveals, resistance was a natural response to enslavement that only increased and intensified in a nation birthed in freedom. Like the enslaved people they advocated and fought for, American abolitionists also took inspiration from both foreign and domestic sources. The movement's transcendence of regional and national boundaries is well documented. It is epitomized in the international endeavors of William Wells Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Maria Weston Chapman. Scholarly emphasis on the overseas adventures of American abolitionists has tended to obscure the fact that while earning their reputations as transatlantic agitators and transatlantic thinkers, they remained deeply devoted to their native country. In truth, they obsessed over its shortcomings, which derived from slavery, and dedicated their lives to eliminating them. As historians of Northern nationalism have demonstrated, abolitionists' attachment to the United States did not impede their sectional identification. To the contrary, the hatred of the South and its peculiar institution encouraged a devotion to the North that increased and intensified over time. Across the antebellum era, abolitionists came to believe that as a geographic region rooted in the principles of freedom and equality, the Northern states were far superior to the Southern states, which suffered from slavery and the attendant vices of racism and violence. The North's comparatively egalitarian institutions and ideals unified abolitionists and fortified their movement. At the same time, they served as a model for the entire nation to both aspire to and achieve. For free Black Northerners, who were in the vanguard of American abolitionism, race trumped region. Demonstrating that W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness, they identified primarily with their people and their nation. In a society blighted by both slavery and white supremacy, these collective identifications reinforced each other and at times became indistinguishable. More than any other facet of antebellum African-American thought, writes historian Patrick Rael, Black takes on American nationalism constructed the African descendant as a people, united in purpose and destiny. Not surprisingly, then, Black abolitionists were both black nationalists and United States nationalists who displayed a revolutionary commitment to liberating their enslaved countrymen and women that was both racial and national in nature. Evidence of this commitment came in the rejection of colonization, a policy that sought the permanent removal of all black people from beyond the nation's borders. While some free African Americans supported voluntary immigration to Haiti, Africa, or other destinations abroad to escape persecution at home, the vast majority condemned colonization as a racist conspiracy to deprive them of their rights as natural-born citizens. In articles published in black-owned newspapers like Freedom's Journal and the North Star, and in speeches delivered at regional, state, and national colored conventions, black men and women vowed to stay in the land of their nativity and fight. In historian Jacqueline Bacon's words, declaring themselves unwilling to leave their enslaved brethren and asserting their rights as Americans, African Americans continued their militant stand in pursuit of freedom. For enslaved people and their allies, the language and symbols of American freedom both justified and inspired revolutionary violence in the pursuit of two interconnected objectives: the death of slavery and the birth of a new and truly egalitarian nation. The result was a decades-long effort that explodes the idea that in the early United States, slave and anti-slavery resistance was passive and peaceful. On cotton farms and sugar plantations across the South, and in small towns and large cities throughout the North, enslaved people and their allies took great solace in the United States revolutionary tradition. Like the Republic's founding fathers, who against almost insurmountable odds took up arms against their oppressors, they eagerly embraced the dangerous and deadly fight for freedom. To prove this, the chapters that follow are divided into two parts. The first examines the sectional contest over the meaning of the language and symbols of freedom, while the second investigates violent slave and anti-slavery resistance through the lens of early American nationalism. Chapters are arranged thematically, though chronological ordering is employed whenever possible. The first and second chapters offer a snapshot of the half-century between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, when slavery's opponents openly contested the appropriation of the U.S. flag and the 4th of July by the institution's supporters. The third considers Frederick Douglass's most illustrious oration, in which he contemplated the significance of Independence Day and the Declaration of Independence for enslaved people. Chapters 4 and 5 focus on enslaved people who forcefully, and in some cases violently, resisted their oppressors. The final two chapters consider violent abolitionism in the decade before the Civil War, culminating in John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859. A brief coda on black soldiers' fidelity to the American flag suggests how far the United States has come in the fight for racial equality and the distance that remains to be traveled. Part 1. Contesting. 1. The Flag. Few lines in American history are as well known as those comprising the first verse of Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner. Written on a ship floating in Baltimore Harbor after American forces survived a bombardment from British ships during the War of 1812. The opening stanza can still be heard emanating from the sites of political rallies, military exercises, and athletic contests across the United States. Key's colorful description of the national flag flying above Fort McHenry is a triumphant expression of American patriotism. It holds a special place in the minds of the nation's citizens, even if many of them are unable to recite its lyrics accurately. While the most famous line of the national anthem is the opening exclamation, "Oh, can you see by the dawn's early light?" the most infamous line appears in the third of the song's 4 original sections. Assailing the enslaved people who had absconded from their American owners and volunteered for the British armed forces during the war, it surmises these traitorous bondmen had either fled in fear before the Battle of Baltimore or lost their lives in the process of betraying their pro-slavery republic. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. After reveling in the alleged demise of these formerly captive people, the song repeats its inspiring crescendo. The star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Key's lyrics did not go unchallenged. Years later, the Quaker abolitionist Dr. Edwin Attlee parodied the national song to illuminate the plight of the fugitive slaves who fought alongside the British against the United States in the hope of becoming free. Unlike Key's original poem, this revision depicts the plight of all enslaved people whose blood daily streamed under the lash of their American oppressors, while the national banner, with its stars mocking freedom, is fitfully gleaming. Instead of a land of liberty, the United States was a shelter for slavery. No refuge is found on our unhallowed ground, for the wretched in slavery's manacles bound. Should the nation fail to achieve its boasted ideals, our star-spangled banner at half-mast shall wave, o'er the deathbed of freedom, the home of the slave. As the two contrasting compositions demonstrate, the American flag was from its inception a controversial and contested symbol. Its history is familiar. In the Revolutionary War era, colonists across Great Britain's 13 rebellious colonies flew a variety of colors to rally support against British tyranny. But it was a red and white striped flag adopted by the Sons of Liberty in Boston that served as a model for many of the Republic's earliest flags. In 1818, after several decades of confusion over the proper design of the national standard, the federal government passed a law requiring the flag of the United States to include 13 alternating red and white stripes in honor of the original states. The upper left quarter of the banner was to consist of a blue field with 20 white stars, corresponding with the numbers of states in the Union at the time of the law's adoption. Additional stars were to be added upon the admission of new states. While the flag's dimensions and the pattern of the growing constellation of stars went unmentioned, the result was a standardized banner that remains recognizable today. Though universally regarded as a national emblem, the American flag meant different things to different people in the early United States. There were a variety of reasons for these disparate views, with attitudes toward slavery being among the most prominent. For slavery's defenders, the flag represented countless liberties, including the right of white citizens to buy, sell, and own black people. For slavery's opponents, it symbolized the American Republic's failed promise of freedom. In a nation shamed by slavery, its flag was a blot that invited and deserved condemnation both at home and abroad. To be sure, abolitionists and their anti-slavery predecessors' feelings toward the flag stemmed from a love, rather than hate, of their nation. Despite the growing interest of historians in the organized effort to end slavery, there is a dearth of scholarship on the influence of United States nationalism on the movement and its culture. Important analyses of anti-slavery texts and images often embrace an international perspective, as it demonstrates the dynamic and sophisticated nature of these materials and the people who produce them. At other times, these studies see the development of a strong sectional identity among antebellum Northerners as the impetus behind increased slave opposition. As a result, American nationalism's impact on abolitionism has largely gone unnoticed. This chapter offers a corrective. Through an analysis of anti-slavery and abolitionist culture in the decades before the Civil War, it reveals the existence of a sectional skirmish over the meaning of the American flag that fed the much larger national conflict over slavery. When Southern slave owners and traders flew the stars and stripes over plantations, pens, and auction houses, they provoked a strong reaction from Northern speakers, writers, and illustrators who rejected the standard's use as a pro-slavery icon and endeavored to reclaim it. Driven by an intense love of country, slavery's opponents made the reclamation of the American flag as a symbol of freedom an important part of their crusade. By abolishing the South's peculiar and unpatriotic institution, they strove to redeem both the Republic and its most recognizable symbol in their own eyes and those of the world as well. Though proud and patriotic people, These American activists valued the opinions of their international counterparts and continually looked to them for validation. In the summer of 1822, while traveling through Paris, Kentucky, James Dickey's heart leapt when he heard music in the distance, which he interpreted as the approach of a military pageant or parade. The minister's anticipation quickly turned to terror when, instead of witnessing a patriotic procession, he saw dozens of enslaved people walking together.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?